Thank you, Madam Chair, and happy birthday
Thank you.
again. Happy birthday again. Secretary Bernhardt, thank you for appearing before the subcommittee this morning in your first hearing since you were confirmed as Secretary of Interior. Although this is a budget hearing, I'm not going to spend much time going over your budget proposal. I think it's fair to say the administration's proposal is dead on arrival. We simply are not going to defund the Land and Water Conservation Fund or reduce the payment in lieu of taxes program or cut programs to fulfill programs that fulfill the trust and treaty obligations to Native Americans. Instead, we will work on a bipartisan budget agreement as we've done in the past, and we will prevent sequestration and meet our needs as a nation. We could also spend this entire hearing probing your various conflicts of interest. It's clear you are making decisions that benefit former clients instead of the American people, but the Inspector General has opened an investigation, and we will be interested in reviewing those findings. So I will instead use my limited time talking about policy. Let me start with climate change. Mr. Secretary, you said at a hearing last week you are, quote, not losing sleep over scientific reports that carbon dioxide is at the highest levels ever recorded in human history. This is deeply troubling. Let me tell you, along with many Americans, I am losing sleep over climate change and over this administration's stubborn refusal to address its threat. What we see with our own eyes every day, extreme weather events, droughts, heat waves, is clear. We are already seeing that our national parks and public lands are some of the most vulnerable. Tribal nations are in the bullseye. Our forests in New Mexico and across the Southwest are experiencing more catastrophic wildfires. Drought in the Colorado River looks like it is here to stay at a time when 40 million people rely on that increasingly stressed source of water. As my colleague, Chairman Murkowski, well knows, Alaskan natives are literally losing their communities to increasing ocean levels and facing the decline of traditional food sources like walrus because of decreased sea ice. And this data point exemplifies the crisis. Glacier National Park in Montana is unlikely to have any actual glaciers by 2030. Wildlife habitats are changing and more species than ever are threatened with extinction. A United Nations panel just identified climate change as a major cause of our current biodiversity crisis, which threatens 1 million species of plants and animals worldwide. Climate change is the most pressing issue of our time. It is an existential threat. Secretary Bernhardt, federal law, including the Federal Lands Policy Management Act, the National Park Service Organic Act, and the Wilderness Act, require the department to manage federal lands and waters for the benefit of future generations. It is impossible to meet that mandate if you disregard climate change. I was troubled you attempted to lay the department's lack of action at Congress's feet during your recent testimony before a House committee. This isn't about shalls, as you put it, blaming Congress as a dodge. This is about how you choose to exercise the broad discretion Congress vested in the Department of Interior. Past administrations chose to take on climate change, to harness the agency's vast authority to tackle our generation's defining issue. But instead, this administration is actively working to dismantle every tool to address the threat, including gutting the BLM methane waste rule and rescinding policies that address climate change planning and mitigation. This administration's focus on energy dominance has wiped out all climate change efforts. There are also plenty of other areas where I see the devastating effects of your policies. For instance, on the 5-year anniversary of the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument in southern New Mexico, I am concerned about Interior's reduction of national monuments, even those with broad support in the community. I'm troubled by efforts to roll back species protection, where it's gutting sage grouse management plans or weakening Endangered Species Act regulations, and reports that the department is actively working to politicize science, including bearing a study showing the devastating effects of the pesticide chlorpyrifos on 70% of species listed under the Endangered Species Act. I'm concerned the department is making funding decisions in a mott that threatened an Indian water rights settlement that took 51 years to resolve. After months of negotiations, the department is now withholding appropriated dollars. The parties in the project are shovel-ready, but Interior is stalling. And I'm concerned by the actions that disregard the importance of natural and cultural resource values if they get in the way of development. We see this in the department's efforts to expand oil and gas development in the region surrounding Chaco Cultured National Historic Park in New Mexico. The department keeps pressing forward even though Native American tribes in Congress have objected to the effect that this development will have on such a sacred landscape. I could go on, but I'm eager to ask questions and hear what you have to say. You have had a hand in many of these decisions, Secretary Bernhardt, decisions I view as deeply damaging. So I appreciate the chance to have a frank discussion on these policies. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, on March 27th, I sent you a letter along with 16 other senators asking for answers on a number of questions that related to your position on a number of issues related to monuments review performed by your predecessor, Secretary Zinke. I received a response from one of your aides, Casey Hammond, last week that didn't even attempt to answer the question, so I wanted to revisit the issues again with you. As you know, the President has already attempted to modify the Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monuments, and the Department has moved forward with certain activities that implement his direction. But Interior's 2017 report also included recommendations to modify 8 other monuments, including 2 monuments in New Mexico, the Rio Grande del Norte and the Oregon Mountains Desert Peaks. The letter we sent you asked you to clarify that the department does not intend to take any additional actions to implement the recommendations in the report, including actions to revise the boundaries or make planning changes to the 2 monuments in New Mexico I just mentioned affected by the review, the Rio Grande del Norte and Oregon Mountains Desert Peaks. This is really a yes or no, Mr. Secretary. Has the department taken any actions to date, or does the department have any plans to take future actions, including making additional recommendations to the White House for presidential action that implement changes to the 8 other monuments called for by Secretary Zinke's review?
Senator, thank you for that question. I'm going to give you a little more than a simple yes or no, but I think the answer is no, and here's why. From my perspective, the Secretary was asked to put a report together by the President. He put that report together. He submitted it to the President. It is before the President. And I've not received any request to do a different report, and so I will not take any action on any monuments. The President is ultimately the holder of the pen with the Antiquities Act.
Yeah. Let's move on to the issue of resource management planning and national monuments. I want to make sure you and I agree on the law. Is it true that the department takes a number of pre-leasing steps before it ever issues a lease for oil, gas, or coal on public lands, such as undertaking a resource management plan or identifying areas open to leasing and associated constraints?
The answer to that is yes, it's generally true.
And isn't it true that the BLM Land Use Planning Manual describes specific steps that in coal and fluid minerals leasing as identifying areas open to leasing and constraints at the land use planning level? In fact, I think, and you've said yes to this, the Secretary may not hold a lease sale under this part unless the lands containing the coal deposits are included in a comprehensive land use plan. That's CFR 433421. Do you agree that the department considers relevant land use plans a necessary pre-leasing step prior to issuing leases?
At this time, I cannot think of an exception to that general rule.
Are you aware that each Interior Appropriations bill since FY 2002 has contained a provision prohibiting the department from expending funds for, quote, leasing, pre-leasing, or related activities under the Mineral Leasing Act within the boundaries of a national monument as such boundary existed on January 20th, 2001.
I'm not familiar with that specific limitation, but I have no reason to doubt what you read.
The preferred alternative in the management plan for the Grand Staircase Escalante Monument surrounding lands identifies opening lands removed by the proclamation to oil and gas and coal leasing, as well as constraints and coal suitability determinations. As we both agreed, these activities are part of the department's typical pre-leasing activities. How is this pre-leasing work not a violation of appropriations law?
Oh, I don't think it is, but I will go look at it and I'll
I
study
hope
the
you
issue
look
and
at
come
it
back.
because it's pretty clear to me.
Roger that.
I'll be asking the GAO to look into this issue and what I believe to be a clear violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act in the interest of the rule of law and safeguarding taxpayer funds from mismanagement. Will you commit to halting all further department work on this proposed plan until the GAO has ruled on this issue?
I will commit to studying the issue personally and coming back and tell you what.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, as you and I have discussed in the past, the Chaco National Historic
Right.
Park sits in a sacred, if incredibly fragile region, and I'm glad that you will have an opportunity to see this for yourself when you visit next week. Chaco is known around the world as the heart of a culture that inhabited the Four Corners area for hundreds of years, but the park covers only a fraction of the archaeologically and culturally significant sites and artifacts. This year, this area is at real and continued risk. Over the last 3 years, the Bureau of Land Management has proposed new oil and gas leasing in the greater Chaco Canyon landscape area. Protection of the area surrounding the national park is therefore of vital importance. That is why I recently introduced legislation to formally codify the informal assurances I and the tribes received for the past 10 years to establish a 10-mile buffer around the park. As you know, last year's FY19 Appropriation Act included report language that directed the BLM to, quote, refrain from leasing within a 10-mile radius of the Chaco Culture National Historic Park. Notwithstanding this prohibition, the BLM subsequently offered dozens of leases, including 9 leases within the 10-mile buffer area that protects Chaco. Does Interior's decision to offer these 9 leases within the 10-mile buffer violate the appropriations report language?
I'd have to look at the language, but generally, appropriation reports are not binding as a matter of law.
And
It may have violated the spirit, if that's what you're
yeah,
suggesting.
well, the report, so you're basically saying anything
I
that's
don't
in
know.
there,
I'd
you're
have to
gonna,
look.
no, but you're correct, it's not binding, so, but it's put in there for a specific purpose. So basically, when you see that kind of language, you're just gonna ignore it.
No, that's not what I'm
Well-
saying. You just asked me as if a matter of law, it was
Yeah,
prohibited, and I said I don't.
Well,
think it is.
I
That doesn't
think-
mean that doesn't mean it's not very important and needs to be thought through. And frankly, I think before the last lease sale, the Navajo tribe sent a letter, and I pulled those parcels, as soon as I saw the letter. So we'll work with you on it. I'm going out there on Monday to see it myself, and I'll work with you and Senator Heinrich on it.
thank you. Secretary Bernhardt, I mentioned my concerns with your recent testimony before the House committees regarding your department's obligations with respect to climate change. You have testified previously that Congress hasn't explicitly required you to take specific actions to mitigate climate change. I would disagree with you there. If you look at the Endangered Species Act, for example, very, very specific language. And I would just note on the Endangered Species Act
the secretary shall determine any species is endangered from man-made factors affecting its continued existence. And then it says you have a duty to use the best science, to administer DOI programs to protect species, to a duty to avoid jeopardy, and a duty to avoid taking of a species.
So I don't-
That's the one, I haven't asked a question yet. That is the strongest Endangered Species Act in the entire world. Everybody in the world looks up to us as a country with an Endangered Species Act. They try to pass laws like it. Many times they don't enforce them. But with that kind of language, and when you have a UN report that's talking about 1 million species endangered as a result of climate, I would really, really hope that you would reconsider the idea that you're not going to do anything about this. And this is my question. And that's just one example, I think. That the laws in your department that give you instruction are very specific. But, and we hope you won't, hope you won't ignore them. But instead of meeting these challenges, your administration has consistently taken actions that disregard the need to address climate change, like gutting the Bureau of Land Management's methane waste rule, a rule which would have stopped nearly 2 million tons of methane from being released. So I'm curious what your position would be if Congress stepped in and did exactly as you suggested. Mr. Secretary, would you support or oppose additional congressional guidance directing you to act more clearly to protect public lands in the context of climate change and manage our public lands to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
So my view is if Congress wants to do that to the public lands, they should make that decision.
Would you support that?
Our
That's
role,
what the question
I
was. Would
certainly
you
work
support or oppose?
I'd certainly work with you on it.
Well,
in-
does that
in the
mean you would
abstract.
support it?
Well, we haven't written anything, but if you want to do something, depending on what you want to do, we're happy to work with you on it. It's my belief, and I don't want to leave you with the misimpression, because this is what we actually do. Actually today, at 10:45 last night, I was reading an environmental assessment that, that had extensive discussion about climate change. We already incorporate climate change factors into our ESA listing process. Our role is to assure that the decisions we make are fully informed by science, and we rely on that very best science. So I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't do that. We absolutely have to do that. Reclamation uses thoughts about future climate change to deal with water scarcity issues in the future. We have hundreds, literally, of studies at USGS right now about different things related to climate change. So we completely respect that climate is changing and the need to study it and address it. What my point was is if you want us to say we're going to stop all oil and gas development on federal lands because of climate change, you need to tell us that in a law, because otherwise we simply are not required to do that, and it's not appropriate to do.
I don't think the Congress has been considering that.
Absolutely, they have. That's exactly what we were talking about on the other side of the aisle.
Oh, well, let me ask you another question here, because you won't say whether you will support or oppose this
theoretical
legislation. Well, it's a very simple support
I'd
or
absolutely
oppose
work with
giving
you
you
on
direction.
coming up with issues to address climate change on federal lands to the extent that we can figure out what those would be.
Okay. I just mentioned the UN report with the species being threatened. Since 2017, BLM has offered 450% more Western acres to oil and gas industry than offered in 2016, and nearly 1/4 of these leases were within a wildlife corridor or state wildlife priority area for big game. In my home state of New Mexico, more than 80% of BLM leases were on state wildlife priority areas. Yet Interior has done little on the conservation side when it comes to wildlife corridors. That's one reason why last week I introduced the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act to improve wildlife connectivity by creating more tools to protect these corridors.
We need to be working on on a landscape scale to protect species and their habitats. A piecemeal strategy is too little, too late. I'm disappointed then that the administration once again proposed eliminating landscape conservation cooperatives, a program that brings together the best and the brightest across federal, state, tribal, local, and NGO communities to tackle thorny landscape issues like migration corridors. For many years running, we've included report language directing the agency to continue the program, but for the last 2 years, the department ignored our directives. Most of the LCCs have shut down. I believe this is a real step backwards. Mr. Secretary, in 2018, Interior issued a secretarial order to preserve big game habitats, and a couple of weeks ago, Interior set aside $2.1 million in federal grants for state and local partner projects that will protect big game migration corridors. So in theory, Interior does at least support the concept of preserving wildlife corridors, correct?
It's not in theory, it's in reality. I've sat down
your
with
answer is yes.
every governor and had a
support it.
conversation that says the following: Governor, if you will work with me to develop a migration corridor, whatever it is, and identify it, the governor does that, then I will do everything in our legal power to protect that corridor within our own legal authorities. And I've said that to the Wyoming governor, the Arizona governor, the Utah governor. I want to work with governors to do that, and if you have legislation that you think does that, I think that we have to allow the governors to identify the corridors because they have the scientific expertise with their fish and wildlife agencies. But to the extent that they can, we want to work with them on it, and we've actually invested. Some of the states didn't have the sophistication of studies and research to support where the corridors were. So we've invested with them to do that. And so I would very much like to do that. I think it's critical for American wildlife.
I'm very happy to hear that you're willing to protect corridors. I'm going to go right from here, get with my governor, and we're going to make a proposal to you on corridors so that we can move forward
I'm very open to that.
Sounds great. And I just want to totally, Mr. Secretary, support the chairman on this issue because I'm the ranking, she's with me over on the Indian Affairs Committee, and we would love to have you over there and talk specifically about Native American issues. But when it comes to these law enforcement issues, broadening out murdered and missing indigenous women, the law enforcement situation on the reservation on tribal nations is pathetic. If you just take the figures, which we unveiled last week in the committee, if you're off reservation, you have 30 times more resources. If you're on reservation, it is a pathetic amount. And that's using the normal, numbers per thousand, comparing on reservation, off reservation. And so the best thing you could do is get the Justice Department to ask for those resources, for the FBI agents, for the BIA investigators, all of those kinds of folks.
I can't say exactly what we're doing there, but I get it. And one thing for you to really know is, like, this is really for the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, for us as a group, this is really a very high priority, just like it is with you. And we want to work with you and coordinate with you and win on this issue and succeed, because it's a terrible story.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I'm glad you're really focusing on it. And I can tell you, in the Indian Affairs Committee, we had a very low-level Justice Department person that didn't even know the comparison and how bad the situation was, and they wouldn't commit to anything and doing anything. So you working with the Attorney General, the Attorney General coming to Alaska, I hope there's a big push here. I don't mean to end up on a negative question, but I'm just deeply concerned that the president is planning to take a nonpartisan celebration and turn it into some kind of de facto political rally. As I hope you know, spending taxpayer dollars on political activity violates appropriations law, The longstanding government-wide prohibition included annually in the Financial Services Appropriations Bill makes it illegal for agencies or contractors to spend taxpayer dollars on publicity and propaganda activities. The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office defines those terms as, and I quote here, purely partisan activities and self-aggrandizing activities. Mr. Secretary, can you assure us that no funds appropriated by this subcommittee will be spent on activities that are partisan or that serve purely to aggrandize the president? I'm talking here about this 4th of July celebration.
Absolutely, I can give you that commitment. I think it's fantastic that the president might take time to join folks on the National Mall to celebrate America's Independence Day. I think it's a value for us to be expanding the overall access to the mall. I'm hopeful that the president will speak, but it's a celebration about America, and America has a great story to tell, and we can have a great celebration. We can do it in a way that won't conflict with the Capitol concert and things like that. So I think it's a good thing, and I think that, frankly, if any president were celebrating the 4th of July, saluting America, we all should be positive about that. And I will make absolutely sure that every dollar we spend complies with the law. I will promise you that.
Good.
But I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
And I think getting more people, we've been able to move things in a way that will allow more people to see the fireworks from the mall. And in my opinion, that's fantastic. I don't know if you've done it, but I've done it a lot. And it's the best place in America to watch the fireworks.
Yeah,
And it should be.
I think it's important to have a 4th of July celebration. I hope you're totally transparent with us, and all federal agencies are, on how much money's going to be spent, especially the traditional amount that's spent here on the Hill for the celebration, and then how much more it's going to cost for all the additional expenditures, because I think people would be very interested in knowing what's happening with the dollars, and then make sure your staff that looks at Public Law 116-6, which is in as I said, annually inappropriate.
respect that.
Interpreted.
I respect that.
Just be careful. We want you to be here for a while.